Welcome back to the channel. I know many of you use these videos to help you fall asleep, so before you drift off, I'd love it if you could leave a comment letting me know where you're listening in from around the world. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you enjoyed this episode. The adventurer stepped off the creaking cart, his boots sinking slightly into the muddy road. Before him lay the village, perched at the very edge of the forbidden forest like a nervous animal too close to a predator. The air was thick, not just with mist, but with an unspoken tension, as though the very ground was holding its breath. Dilapidated houses, their wooden walls stained with age and rot, lined the narrow street, and from every shadowed window, eyes followed him, wide, silent, and full of fear. He ignored their stares, his heart quickened not by their fear, but by the allure of the unknown. Stories of the forest had travelled far, a place no one dared to enter, and, more chillingly, from which no one ever returned. Yet for him, it was irresistible. The mystery that lay beneath its dark canopy called to him, like a whisper only he could hear. As he approached the edge of the village, an old woman, her back hunched like a crooked branch, stepped into his path. Her gnarled hands trembled as she reached out, her eyes wild with desperation. "Don't go in there," she rasped, her voice cracking like dry leaves. "The forest, it's not meant for men like you." He barely gave her a glance, shaking off her hand. "Superstitions," he muttered under his breath, stepping around her. But even as he left her behind, he could feel the weight of the villagers' stares on his back. Their faces, pale and drawn, were masks of silent warnings he would not heed. The forest loomed ahead, its edges swallowed in a thick fog, the towering trees seeming to bend under their own ancient weight. As his feet crossed the boundary from open air to shadowed woodland, a strange stillness fell around him. The wind that had once rustled through the village was gone. The birds, which had sung in the distance, fell silent. Only his own breathing filled his ears, shallow and uneven. He walked further, the darkness growing denser with each step. The ground beneath his feet felt wrong, softer, as though it pulsed with a hidden life. He glanced around. The trees were unlike any he had ever seen before, their trunks twisted, knotted as though in pain. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, crawling across the forest floor, moving even when nothing else did. His heart beat a little faster now, the thrill of danger mixing with a creeping unease. He told himself it was only nerves, but as he ventured deeper, that strange quietness grew heavier, pressing against his chest. The forest seemed to breathe with him, and each breath was a reminder that he was trespassing in a place where he did not belong. Ahead, the path split in two, the fork barely visible through the shifting fog. He paused, feeling for the first time a flicker of doubt. It was then, out of the corner of his eye, that he saw it, just a movement, too quick to be sure of, a shadow, or something darker, shifting between the trees. He blinked, turning to focus, but there was nothing, only the silence, broken by the faintest sound, a whisper, carried by the still air. His name. He shook his head, forcing himself to move forward, his footfalls now louder in the unnatural stillness. It was just the wind, he told himself, just the wind. But the forest felt otherwise. The adventurer had been walking for hours, the twisted maze of trees growing denser around him. Darkness had begun to seep between the branches as the sun fell behind the horizon, leaving only the cold, grey light of dusk to guide him. His legs ached, and the chill that had settled in the air gnawed at his bones. Just as he began to think about setting up camp for the night, the faint outline of a structure appeared through the tangled thicket. A small cabin, barely standing, its roof slumped like an old man's shoulders. Relief washed over him. Shelter. It was unexpected but welcome. He approached the cabin cautiously, his hand instinctively resting on the hilt of his knife. The door creaked open with a long, shuddering moan as he pushed it. Inside, a fire crackled weakly in a stone hearth, casting a dull glow over the cramped interior. The smell of damp wood and old earth hung heavy in the air. And then he saw him. An old man sat hunched in a rickety chair near the fire, his face gaunt, eyes hollow, as if he had seen too many winters. His skin was pale, almost grey in the flickering light, and his clothes hung off him like forgotten rags. He turned his head slowly, and their eyes met. "You shouldn't be here," the old man croaked, his voice rough as if it hadn't been used in days, maybe longer. "The forest doesn't like strangers." The adventurer hesitated, closing the door behind him. "I'm just passing through," he said, his voice steady, though the unease that had been growing in his chest since entering the forest stirred again. "Looking for a place to rest before I continue." The old man let out a harsh, humorless laugh that sent a shiver crawling up the adventurer's spine. "Passing through? No one passes through. Not anymore. The forest keeps what it takes." The adventurer stepped closer to the fire, feeling its warmth chase away the cold that clung to him. "I've heard the stories," he replied, trying to keep his tone light, dismissive. "Curses, spirits, people vanishing. It's just superstition." The old man's expression darkened. His eyes narrowed as though he could see past the adventurer's bravado, straight into the growing fear that lay beneath. "Superstition," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the crackling fire. "You think the forest cares what you believe? It doesn't matter what you think, boy. It's alive. It's hungry, and you've walked right into its jaws." A long silence fell between them, the only sound the low crackle of burning wood. The adventurer didn't know whether to laugh off the old man's ramblings or heed his warning, but something about the way the old man spoke, the way his voice trembled with years of fear and regret, made the adventurer's skin prickle with doubt. "I've been here longer than I care to remember," the old man continued, his eyes distant, as if lost in some dark memory. "I've seen those like you come, full of pride, thinking they'll be the ones to conquer this place. But it doesn't work like that. The forest plays with you, twists the paths, whispers your name until you can't tell what's real anymore. It takes you, piece by piece, until there's nothing left but your shadow. Then it swallows you whole." The adventurer felt a knot tightening in his gut, but he shook his head, refusing to give in to the old man's fear. "I'm not like the others," he said firmly, though the conviction in his voice wavered ever so slightly. "I'll find my way out." The old man's gaze sharpened, his thin lips curling into a grim smile. "That's what they all said." Later, when the fire had burned low and the old man had fallen into a restless sleep, the adventurer lay on the cabin's cold floor, his body too tense to fully relax. His mind buzzed with the old man's words, even as he tried to dismiss them as the ravings of a hermit who had lived too long in the dark. But that night, sleep brought no comfort. In his dreams, the forest was alive. The trees bent toward him, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out to pull him deeper into the shadows. He could hear whispers all around him, calling his name, faint but insistent, growing louder with every breath he took. Figures moved at the edge of his vision, dark, twisted shapes that darted between the trees, always just out of reach. His heart pounded as he ran, the forest closing in, suffocating him with its presence. Suddenly, he stopped. A figure stood before him, a shadow among shadows, its eyes gleaming with a malevolent hunger. He tried to scream, but no sound escaped his lips. The figure took a step forward, and then another, until it was inches from him. It whispered his name, soft as the wind, but it felt like a promise. He woke with a start, drenched in cold sweat, the old man's words echoing in his mind. "The forest keeps what it takes." Morning came, but the light brought no sense of safety. The adventurer woke with a dull ache in his bones, the air inside the cabin thick and oppressive. The old man had vanished, leaving only the faint scent of smoke and the dying embers of the fire. No farewell, no trace of his presence, just an empty, creaking cabin. For a fleeting moment, the adventurer wondered if the old man had been real at all, or simply another trick of the forest. Shaking off the lingering unease, he gathered his belongings and stepped outside, greeted by the same unnatural quiet that had filled the forest the day before. The trees seemed taller now, their branches knotted together like a woven canopy, trapping the morning fog beneath them. It swirled around his feet, cold and damp, clinging to his skin as though trying to hold him in place. He retraced his steps toward the path he had followed the day before, or at least he tried. The trees, twisted and towering, seemed to have shifted during the night. What should have been a familiar trail was now a tangled mess of brambles and unfamiliar undergrowth. He cursed under his breath, pushing through the dense foliage, but every turn only led him further from anything recognizable. The path was gone. Panic flickered at the edges of his mind. He had been careful, meticulous, even, marking the route he had taken. Yet, no matter where he turned, the landscape was different. The forest itself had rearranged around him, as if it had been waiting for him to let down his guard. He stopped to catch his breath, leaning against a gnarled tree. The bark felt wrong beneath his fingers, slick and damp like old flesh. He pulled his hand away, grimacing, and his heart jumped as he noticed something carved into the trunk. Strange symbols, jagged, spiraling lines, etched deep into the wood. They pulsed faintly, like veins just beneath the surface. His eyes followed the carvings, tracing the twisted patterns, and then he noticed them. Clothing, torn, tattered remnants of shirts and jackets hung from the trees like forgotten offerings. They were shredded, darkened with age and something more sinister, dried blood. His stomach twisted as he recognized them for what they were, the remains of those who had come before him, the forest's past victims. His breath quickened. The old man's warning rang in his ears, louder now, harder to ignore. You've walked right into its jaws. He forced himself to move, shaking off the grim discovery, determined to find his way out. But as he pressed forward, the forest seemed to close in around him. The trees were growing thicker, their roots twisted like skeletal hands, reaching up from the ground. He could feel it now, something watching him, just out of sight, a presence that trailed his every step. The sun, once visible through the cracks in the branches, was now nothing more than a faint glow behind a veil of mist. The deeper he ventured, the more the light seemed to fade, swallowed by the forest's endless shadows. Hours passed, or maybe only minutes. It was impossible to tell. The forest twisted time as easily as it twisted the landscape. His footsteps grew heavier, exhaustion weighing him down, when suddenly the air around him changed. A soft rustling, barely noticeable at first, grew louder. He froze, listening. Leaves shifted in the distance, and then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps, light, careful, and far too close for comfort. He spun around, heart pounding in his throat. There was nothing behind him but the thick wall of trees and mist. But the footsteps continued, growing bolder, circling him now. A faint, sickening realization crept over him. He wasn't alone anymore. From the corner of his eye, he caught a glimpse of movement, a shadow, darker than the others, darting between the trees. He turned sharply, eyes scanning the tree-line, but the figure was gone. "Who's there?" His voice cracked in the silence. Only the forest answered, with a low, almost mocking whisper of wind through the branches. He moved again, faster now, his pulse quickening. The footsteps followed, sometimes close, sometimes distant, but always there. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being herded, guided deeper into the heart of the forest. Every time he tried to double back, the path behind him would shift, vanishing into the tangled woods. Night fell quickly, too quickly, as though the forest had decided it was time. Darkness bled into the mist, swallowing the last vestiges of daylight. The trees seemed to shift in the growing gloom, their twisted forms stretching taller, their branches reaching like skeletal fingers toward the sky. He could hear it now, faint, inhuman voices, rising with the wind. They were distant, but growing closer, their words just out of reach. The footsteps quickened. He broke into a run, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. The forest floor shifted beneath him, roots curling like snakes, trying to trip him, to slow him down. The voices grew louder, a dissonant chorus of whispers, wrapping around his mind, twisting into something almost familiar. And then, ahead, he saw it. A figure stood in the distance, its form barely visible through the swirling mist. It was tall and gaunt, its limbs unnaturally long, its face obscured by shadow. It didn't move, didn't speak, just watched him with cold, empty eyes. He tried to approach, but with every step he took, the figure drifted further into the fog, always just out of reach. And then it was gone, swallowed by the trees. The adventurer's heart raced, panic clawing at his chest. He turned wildly, searching for any sign of an escape, but the forest had closed in on all sides, its paths twisted and gone. He was alone again, or so it seemed, but deep down he knew. The forest was playing with him now, and it wasn't finished. The adventurer pushed onward, every muscle aching, every breath labored. The weight of the forest bore down on him now, an unseen pressure that made the air thick and hard to swallow. The once lively thrill of exploration had curdled into dread, a feeling that gnawed at him with each step. There was no more pretending. This was no ordinary place. The forest was alive, and it was watching him. He could feel it in the way the trees seemed to shift when he wasn't looking, how the fog clung to him like a predator's breath, and the shadows. They had begun to take on shapes. At first, they had been fleeting, like tricks of the light, figures that melted back into the gloom as soon as he turned his head. But now they were more substantial, lingering longer, their forms more defined. He could almost make out faces, faces that seemed blurred and distorted, as if something had twisted them into mockeries of humanity. His thoughts spun in wild circles, trying to cling to any sense of reason. Fatigue was clouding his mind, but beneath that cloud was something else. Fear. Fear that whatever haunted this forest was drawing closer, closing in on him. The old man's voice echoed in his memory, like a ghost whispering in his ear. It takes you piece by piece. The forest was doing just that, taking little pieces of him with every hour he spent here. Then he saw it, a flash of color in the undergrowth, just ahead. He crouched down, parting the thick foliage with trembling hands. There, tangled among the roots, was a torn piece of cloth. It was red, faded, and stained, but unmistakably part of someone's jacket. His heart skipped a beat. It hadn't been long since he had seen clothing like this hanging from the trees, but this was fresh. Someone else had been here recently, perhaps not long before him. He stood, scanning the area with renewed urgency. That's when he noticed the other signs, broken twigs, footprints half buried in the damp soil. Whoever had worn that jacket had run through here, in a blind panic, just as he now wanted to. But there was something else, something worse. Beside the human footprints were others, deep, clawed impressions in the earth, unlike any animal he had ever encountered. They were massive, inhuman, trailing the same path as the fleeing steps. A sickening realization settled over him. Whatever had chased that person might still be nearby. He began to move faster, not quite running, but no longer caring about staying quiet. The trees closed in tighter, their trunks like dark sentinels, watching his every move, and with every few steps he saw more remnants, scraps of clothing, a boot half buried in mud, and worst of all, a patch of dried blood smeared across a tree trunk, as if someone had clung to it in desperation. Panic surged through him, and his pace quickened, but no matter how far he walked, the forest seemed to stretch endlessly ahead of him, an unrelenting labyrinth. He stumbled and fell to his knees, his hands sinking into the damp earth. As he knelt there, catching his breath, he heard it, a rustling, soft, deliberate, and too close. He froze, every nerve on edge. The sound was unmistakable. Footsteps, but not his own. Slowly, he turned his head, scanning the tree line. At first, he saw nothing, just the dense fog and the twisted shapes of the trees. But then, out of the mist, something stepped forward. It was a figure, humanoid, but wrong in every way. Its body was gaunt, its limbs too long, and its skin pale and mottled like the bark of the trees. Its face, if it could even be called a face, was a blur of shifting shadows, as though the features refused to settle, constantly moving and distorting. It stood still, watching him with hollow, sunken eyes. And then, behind it, another figure emerged, and another. Slowly, the forest came alive with them, haunting, ghostly shapes slipping between the trees, their bodies flickering like half-formed nightmares. They moved silently, their heads tilted as if listening for something, their empty eyes fixed on the adventurer. For a moment, he was paralyzed. The horror of what he was seeing rooted him to the spot. His breath caught in his throat. These weren't just hallucinations. They were real. They had once been people, he realized with a sickening clarity. Adventurers, wanderers, villagers, those who had come before him. The forest had twisted them, taken their humanity, and left these hollow shells behind. His breath came in shallow gasps as the figures grew closer, their movements slow and deliberate. He stumbled backward, his mind screaming at him to run. But just as he turned to flee, something else caught his eye. Carvings, deep gouges etched into the trunks of the trees surrounding him. Strange symbols, like those he had seen earlier, but larger, more elaborate. And there, among the carvings, were words, names, dozens of them, all scratched into the wood, barely visible beneath the layers of moss and grime. He stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest, and reached out to touch the names. His fingers brushed over them lightly, tracing the jagged letters, and then he saw it, his own name, carved deep into the bark, fresh and unmistakable. The realization hit him like a blow. The forest had known he was coming long before he had even set foot here. It had been waiting for him, just as it had waited for all the others. His presence here was no accident. He had been lured, drawn in by forces far beyond his understanding, and now the forest had marked him, just as it had marked all its victims. A cold terror gripped him, more profound than anything he had felt before. He could feel the eyes of the shadowy figures on him, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. They weren't just watching him. They were waiting. The adventurer ran. The forest blurred around him, a twisted maze of branches and shadows that seemed to stretch and twist with every step. His breath came in ragged gasps, and his heart thundered in his chest, but the fear drove him forward, faster and faster, deeper into the belly of the forest. Behind him, the ghostly figures followed, their movements unnatural and relentless, gliding between the trees like wraiths in the mist. He didn't know how long he had been running. Time no longer felt real in this place. It warped and stretched like the forest itself, bending to the will of some ancient force. His legs burned, and his vision swam with exhaustion, but stopping wasn't an option. The sense of being hunted, of being herded, was undeniable now. Every instinct screamed that something worse awaited him if he slowed down. And then, through the haze of his panic, he stumbled into it. The trees parted suddenly, as if the forest had pulled back a curtain, revealing a vast clearing. It was like a wound in the heart of the woods, an open space that should not have existed within the endless labyrinth. The air here felt different, heavier, thick with a presence that made his skin crawl. He stopped dead in his tracks, chest heaving, and looked around in wide-eyed horror. At the center of the clearing stood a stone altar. It was ancient, worn smooth by time and weather, yet stained dark with something far older than the forest itself. The stones were slick with dried blood, and strange symbols, symbols like those carved into the trees, were etched into every surface, spiraling and intertwining like veins of some malign force. The ground around the altar was littered with bones, broken and scattered, their whiteness stark against the dark earth. Some were human, others were not. He had found the heart of the forest. The adventurer took a step back, but the ground felt unstable beneath his feet, like it could swallow him whole. The air seemed to hum with a low, throbbing energy, and he could feel it now. This place was alive, not just with the presence of the forest, but with something far older, far darker. The whispers that had once drifted at the edge of his awareness were now clear, circling his mind like a suffocating fog. They called to him, tugging at the edges of his consciousness, pulling him toward the altar. Suddenly, the figures that had been chasing him emerged from the trees, their gaunt forms stepping silently into the clearing. They did not move toward him this time. Instead, they spread out in a wide circle, surrounding the grove. Their hollow eyes were fixed on him, watching with an unnatural stillness, as though waiting for something. Their presence, though terrifying, seemed insignificant compared to the growing sense of malice that radiated from the altar. And then, the forest itself stirred. The ground trembled slightly, as if something beneath the earth was waking. The trees at the edge of the clearing seemed to bow, their gnarled branches bending inward, almost reverently. The adventurer's breath hitched in his throat as the fog thickened, swirling in unnatural patterns above the altar. From the mist, something began to form, a shape massive and terrible, coalescing from the darkness itself. The creatures of the forest revealed themselves. They stepped forward from the shadows, monstrous beings that seemed half flesh, half shadow, their bodies twisting in ways that defied logic. They were tall, towering over him, with limbs too long, and faces that shifted and melted like nightmares made real. Their eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, hungry and ancient, fixed on him with a terrifying intelligence. Their very presence was a violation of the natural world, and the air around them crackled with a dark energy. They moved slowly, circling him with deliberate, predatory grace. Their whispers grew louder now, words he couldn't understand, but their meaning was clear. They had been waiting for him. The forest demanded sacrifices, and he was to be the next. His blood turned to ice as he realized the truth. This was no accident, no random wandering into a cursed place. He had been lured here, drawn in by forces far beyond his understanding. The forest had wanted him, had guided him, had marked him, and now it would claim him. In a frenzy of desperation, he turned to run, but the clearing had changed. The path he had taken to enter was gone, replaced by an impenetrable wall of trees and mist. The figures, the monstrous creatures, and the twisted ghosts of the forest's past victims closed in around him, their whispers merging into a single, insistent voice. "Join us! Join us!" His eyes darted back to the altar, the stone stained with centuries of sacrifice. In that moment, he understood. This was where the forest's victims were taken, where the forest fed on their fear, their flesh, their souls. And now it was his turn. The forest wanted him to offer himself willingly, to lay himself upon that cursed stone and give his life to the ancient, hungry power that dwelled within these trees. But as the creatures closed in, as the dark presence grew stronger, something deep within him rebelled. He wasn't ready to give in, not yet. There had to be another way. He could still fight, still resist the pull of this cursed place. He wasn't like the others. He wouldn't be. With a surge of adrenaline, he grabbed the knife at his belt and brandished it toward the nearest creature, the blade gleaming weakly in the dim light. The figure paused, its head tilting slightly as though amused by his defiance. But before he could act, before he could even think to strike, the ground beneath him gave way. The earth opened up like a mouth, and he fell into the darkness below. The adventurer fell. The world above disappeared as the earth swallowed him whole, plunging him into a suffocating darkness. For a moment, all was chaos. His limbs flailed uselessly, grasping at nothing as he tumbled through the void. Then, with a bone-jarring thud, he hit solid ground. Pain shot through him, and he lay there for several moments, gasping for breath, trying to gather his senses. Slowly, his vision adjusted to the gloom. Above him, the sky was gone, replaced by a web of thick roots and earth, twisted and gnarled, closing him off from the world. He had fallen into some sort of underground chamber, a cavern carved from the very bones of the forest. The air was damp and cold, and the walls seemed to pulse faintly, as though the forest's heartbeat echoed even here. He pushed himself to his feet, wincing as the pain in his side flared. The chamber stretched out before him, dimly lit by a strange, sickly glow emanating from the walls themselves. He staggered forward, his body battered but still functioning. He didn't know where he was, or what awaited him in this subterranean nightmare, but every instinct told him that staying in one place was a death sentence. The whispers had followed him down. They were softer now, but more insidious, wrapping around his thoughts, burrowing into his mind. He could hear the voices of the forest's victims, those who had come before him, pleading, warning, crying out in despair. Their words twisted together, forming a single, haunting chorus. You cannot escape. The forest owns you now. He stumbled through the twisting passageways of the underground labyrinth, his heart pounding in his chest. The ground beneath him felt unstable, as if the earth itself was shifting and alive, guiding him toward something terrible. His footsteps echoed unervingly in the narrow space, accompanied by the faintest sound of movement behind him. The creatures were following, always just beyond his sight, waiting for him to fall. As he rounded a bend in the tunnel, the chamber opened into a vast underground hollow, and there, in the center of it, stood the heart of the forest. It was colossal, a grotesque, pulsating mass of roots and bones, tangled together in an obscene mockery of life. The roots spiraled upward, forming the shape of a twisted, towering figure, part tree, part human, its limbs thick and gnarled, its face a hollow mask of roots and skulls. The adventurer's breath caught in his throat as he realized what he was seeing. This was no mere guardian of the forest. This was the forest. The guardian towered over him, a grotesque being formed from the remnants of those it had claimed over centuries. Bones jutted out from its bark-like skin, twisted and broken, embedded within its massive body. Its face was a swirling mass of skulls, their eyeless sockets staring into him, accusing, as though they too had once fought to escape but had failed. The whispers in his mind grew louder, more demanding. The guardian's empty gaze bore into him, and though it had no mouth, he could feel its words reverberating through the chamber, shaking the very ground beneath his feet. You are mine. The forest had brought him here for a reason. It demanded sacrifices, and now it was offering him a choice: surrender to the inevitable, or resist and fight against a force far older, far stronger than he could ever hope to understand. His grip tightened around the knife, the blade trembling in his hand. He could feel the forest pressing in on him, testing his will, his mind fraying at the edges as the voices urged him to give in. He had seen what happened to those who resisted. Their bones, their souls, had become part of this grotesque monstrosity, bound to the forest for eternity. He was on the brink of the same fate, but something inside him refused to surrender. He wasn't like the others. He wouldn't be. With a roar of defiance, he charged forward, slashing at the mass of roots and bones that formed the creature's body. The blade sunk into the tangled mess, but the Guardian barely flinched. It seemed amused by his futile efforts, the air growing thick with its malevolent presence. The ground beneath him trembled, and roots shot up from the earth, wrapping around his legs, pulling him down. He slashed wildly, cutting at the roots, but more came, thicker and stronger, entangling his arms, his chest, squeezing the breath from his lungs. The forest was too strong. As the roots coiled tighter, dragging him to his knees, the truth finally settled over him. This was not a fight he could win. The forest had always been in control. From the moment he had set foot in its shadow, it had known his fate. The creatures, the shifting paths, the whispers, it had all been leading him here. He had never been the hunter. He had always been the prey. His knife fell from his hand, clattering uselessly to the ground. The roots pulled him closer to the Guardian, its empty skull staring down at him, and in those hollow eyes he saw the faces of the others, the adventurers, the wanderers, the lost souls who had come before him. Their voices echoed in his mind, their torment endless. As the roots wrapped around his throat, choking off his last breath, a final, terrible realization dawned on him. The forest's victims never died. Their bodies became part of the forest, but their souls, those poor, wretched souls, were absorbed into its twisted, eternal consciousness. They became the whispers in the wind, the shifting shadows in the trees, the watchful eyes that lured in the next unwitting traveler. They were trapped, forever bound to the forest's curse, their voices crying out in the dark, warning those who would never listen. As his vision darkened, the adventurer's last thought was one of cold, unrelenting horror. He could already feel the forest taking him, absorbing him, making him part of its ancient, malevolent hunger. And soon, when the next traveler set foot into the forbidden forest, they too would hear his voice, whispering, calling, leading them deeper into the forest's grasp. The forest would never be satisfied. The day was dull, sky overcast, the kind of gloom that sank into your bones if you stood still for too long. The truck driver, a man of years on the road, had been summoned to the company office without much explanation. He didn't care for it. Meetings like this usually meant either overtime or complaints, and neither one was welcome. His boss, a portly man with a thinning comb-over, stood at the edge of his cluttered desk, a map splayed out in front of him. "Got a special route for you," he said, not meeting the driver's eyes. "Ain't no route too special for me," the driver replied with a casual shrug. He leaned in to glance at the map. It was a long stretch of road he hadn't seen before, winding like a snake through a vast, desolate area. It didn't look like much, just another lonely highway. The boss cleared his throat. "This one's a bit different. Urgent. They need the delivery by morning, but you'll be taking the old road. People call it," he hesitated, lowering his voice, "the path of death." The truck driver let out a low chuckle. "Superstitions." He smirked, waving a hand dismissively. "I've been on roads half fallen off cliffs, through deserts where the only thing living are the vultures. It's just another drive." His boss frowned, rubbing the back of his neck. "Yeah, well, it's not just talk. Drivers don't come back sometimes. The road swallows them up, or so they say. Something about things lurking in the fog. But, you know, you're a veteran. The whispers started immediately after the meeting, just as the driver walked past the break room. He caught fragments, his colleagues muttering under their breath. "The path of death, poor guy," one said. "The mist out there is alive, they say," another chimed in. He ignored it all, pulling his truck keys from his pocket, their jingle sounding like a promise of routine. But deep down, a flicker of unease started to stir, buried quickly under his usual confidence. The truck's engine roared to life as the driver pulled out of the lot, his rig rumbling beneath him like a beast awakening from slumber. The sun was already sinking behind heavy clouds, casting long shadows over the road ahead. He didn't mind driving at night. In fact, he preferred it. Fewer people on the road meant fewer distractions. But as he drove further into the countryside, the world seemed to grow quieter, too quiet. The highway narrowed into a single lane, winding through a stretch of forest that felt almost untouched. It was like the trees had been standing there for centuries, silent witnesses to the passage of time. No streetlights, no other vehicles. Just him, his truck, and the darkening road ahead. That's when the fog rolled in. At first, it came in wisps, curling around the edges of his headlights. Harmless, like morning mist. But it thickened unnaturally fast, swallowing the trees, the road, and everything else in sight. He switched on his high beams, but the light only reflected off the dense fog, making it harder to see. "Great," he muttered, gripping the wheel tighter as he slowed the truck down. "Just another thing to deal with." He drove on, the road seeming to stretch endlessly ahead. It was suffocating, too narrow, too isolated. To his left, jagged cliffs dropped off into nothingness, and to his right, the trees loomed closer, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. As he navigated a sharp turn, something flickered in the corner of his vision, just a shadow, barely there. His heart skipped a beat, and he instinctively glanced in the rearview mirror, expecting to see a car behind him. But there was nothing, only the fog, thick and unyielding, wrapping the world in its ghostly embrace. The further he drove, the heavier the air became. A strange pressure began to build in his chest, a creeping sense of unease he couldn't shake. It was like something was watching him. His eyes darted to the side, catching glimpses of movement among the trees, but every time he turned his head, the shadows melted away. "Just your mind playing tricks," he told himself. "Too many horror stories. That's all." But the road wasn't like any other he'd been on. It felt wrong, as though it were alive. The fog wasn't just thick. It moved unnaturally, swirling in slow, deliberate patterns, parting only when his truck passed through, then closing in behind him like a trap. And still, the sense of eyes watching, always just out of sight. The whispers of his colleagues echoed in his mind. The path of death, a place where drivers vanish. He shook his head, annoyed with himself. Nonsense. Superstitions. Yet, the road ahead seemed endless, and the weight of unseen eyes grew heavier with every passing mile. Something wasn't right. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but he pushed on, more determined than ever to reach the end of the road and prove everyone wrong. Still, the shadows danced at the edge of his vision, just beyond the reach of his headlights, and the fog crept closer with every passing moment. The driver swallowed hard, ignoring the growing dread gnawing at his gut. He was a man who trusted the road, but tonight, for the first time in years, he began to wonder if the road could betray him. Night descended fully, wrapping the road in a suffocating blackness that even his high beams couldn't penetrate. The fog had grown so dense that it clung to the truck like a living thing, swirling lazily across the windshield, making it hard to see more than a few feet ahead. The road twisted and turned, each curve feeling more treacherous than the last. That's when the headlights flickered. Just once, barely a blip, but it was enough to send a chill crawling up the driver's spine. He cursed under his breath and tapped the dashboard, as if that would do anything to fix the sudden malfunction. The lights steadied again, cutting through the fog like twin blades. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, shaking his head. Electrical issues. Old truck. He tried to laugh it off. Then, out of nowhere, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. It was so sudden, so stark, that he slammed on the brakes, tires screeching against the asphalt. The truck jerked forward, its massive frame protesting the abrupt stop. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, silhouetted in his dim headlights. An old man, his clothes ragged and torn, his body hunched, as if bent by the weight of unseen years. The driver's heart pounded in his chest. He blinked hard, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Was it real? A hitchhiker, maybe? Or someone lost in the fog? He hit the horn. The blaring noise shattered the eerie silence, echoing off the cliffs and into the void of night. But the figure didn't react. It didn't flinch or move. It simply stood there, staring blankly at him. Slowly, cautiously, the driver leaned forward in his seat, squinting through the fog. The man's face came into focus, pale, gaunt, his eyes wide and hollow, like two black pits. His mouth hung slightly open, lips dry and cracked. There was no life in those eyes, no recognition, just emptiness. A shiver raced down the driver's spine. Something was very wrong. He threw the truck into park, hands trembling as he reached for the door handle. He hesitated. A voice in the back of his mind whispered for him to stay inside, to keep moving, to ignore whatever this was. But his instinct to help, or maybe his curiosity, pushed him to act. He opened the door, stepping out into the cold night air. "Hey, you okay?" he called, his voice swallowed by the fog. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, staring. The driver took a step closer, the gravel crunching beneath his boots. The figure seemed to shimmer in the mist, almost as if it weren't entirely solid. He stopped, heart pounding. "Hey, I'm talking to you." Then, just as quickly as he had appeared, the old man vanished. One moment he was there, standing in the middle of the road, and the next, gone. No fading away, no movement, just gone. The air where he had been standing was now empty, the fog reclaiming the space like nothing had ever been there. The driver stood frozen, breath shallow, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Exhaustion. That had to be it. He was tired, his mind playing tricks on him. He wiped a hand over his face, trying to shake off the lingering fear. He hurried back into the truck, slamming the door behind him. "Must be losing it," he muttered to himself. The engine rumbled back to life as he pushed the accelerator, the truck lurching forward once more. But the unease clung to him, tightening its grip. As he drove further down the winding road, the apparitions began to appear more frequently. Faint figures, shrouded in fog, standing along the roadside, their hollow eyes following him as he passed. Sometimes it was the old man again, other times it was different people. A woman in a long, tattered dress, a child clutching a broken toy, an entire family standing hand in hand, staring blankly as his truck rolled by. They never moved. They never spoke. They were simply there. Each time he saw one, his breath hitched, his knuckles whitening on the steering wheel. He tried to convince himself it wasn't real, that it was just his mind, tired and overworked. But with every new figure that appeared, the fear grew. It was no longer just a sensation. It was real, tangible. Something was wrong with this road. Something far worse than he had imagined. The truck rolled on through the oppressive fog, the road narrowing further, winding endlessly like a serpent coiled around something unseen. The driver's fingers had gone numb from gripping the wheel too tightly, his breath coming in shallow, uneven bursts. It wasn't just the apparitions anymore. Strange noises began to invade the cab, creeping in through the walls of the truck like unwelcome intruders. At first, it was soft, just the faintest hint of whispers, like distant voices carried on the wind. But soon, they grew louder, more insistent. Murmurs filled the air, slithering beneath the hum of the engine, words just out of reach. He couldn't make out what they were saying, but they were there, constant, maddening. And then, the tapping started. A light, rhythmic sound, tap, 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 coming from the windows, like someone gently knocking from the outside. He glanced over, eyes darting to the passenger window, expecting to see another ghostly figure. But there was nothing there, just the fog. The tapping continued. He looked to the other window. Still nothing. His heart pounded in his chest, the rhythmic knocking now echoing inside his skull. It was impossible. No one was out there. No one could be. Then came the sobbing. It was faint at first, barely audible above the tapping, but it grew louder with each passing second. A child's cry, soft, pitiful, and full of despair. His stomach twisted at the sound, a chill creeping down his spine. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once, filling the cab like a suffocating blanket of sorrow. He reached for the radio, desperate for some kind of distraction, some noise to drown out the relentless tapping and crying. Static crackled through the speakers, the sound harsh and grating in the confined space. He turned the dial, trying to find a station, but the static only grew louder, more chaotic. Then, suddenly, the noise cut out, replaced by a voice. It was distorted, low, almost guttural. The words were slow, deliberate, dripping with malice. It called his name. His blood ran cold, the weight of it crashing over him like a tidal wave. He stared at the radio in horror, his mind racing. No one knew he was out here. No one should know his name. Yet, there it was, spoken by a voice that was distinctly not human. The truck's electronics began to malfunction. The dashboard flickered, strange symbols flashing on the screen, symbols he had never seen before, ancient, twisted, like something carved into stone by hands long forgotten. The headlights dimmed, then brightened again, casting sickly beams into the thickening fog. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, overlapping with the sobbing and the tapping. The radio hissed, cutting in and out, the voice repeating his name over and over, each time more distorted, more menacing. His hands trembled on the wheel. He couldn't stop now. He had to keep moving. He had to finish the route. It was the only thing tethering him to reality, the only thing keeping him sane. But the road had other plans. It no longer felt like he was driving forward. The road seemed to twist beneath him, stretching out into infinity, like he was trapped in some kind of loop. No matter how far he drove, no matter how many miles passed on the odometer, it was as though he was going nowhere, just deeper and deeper into the mist, into the jaws of something ancient and hungry. He shook his head, trying to clear the fog clouding his thoughts. Get a grip, man. It's not real. But even as he said it, he knew it was a lie. Something was out there. Something was watching him, stalking him, waiting for him to break. Suddenly, the truck jolted, and the engine sputtered. His heart jumped into his throat. The needle on the gas gauge flickered wildly, despite his tank being full when he started. The truck shuddered, then went silent, coasting to a stop in the middle of the road.
No reception.
No radio.
No lights.
Just silence, and the cold, suffocating fog. He was stranded, alone. Or was he? The stillness was absolute. The truck sat dead in the middle of the road, swallowed by the fog, its engine silent, its headlights dimmed to useless pinpricks in the suffocating darkness. The driver sat in his seat, frozen, staring into the void beyond his windshield. His breath fogged the inside of the glass, and in the dead quiet, the sound of his heartbeat felt like the only thing keeping him tethered to reality. He checked his phone. No signal. Not a single bar of service. He'd expected as much, but seeing the blank screen still sent a cold wave of dread through him. Outside the truck, the road was unervingly still. The fog clung to the edges of the trees like a shroud, and the only sound was the faint rustle of the wind, if it was even the wind. Shadows moved in the corner of his vision, just beyond the reach of the dying headlights, shifting and swaying as though alive. The air was thick with a feeling he couldn't shake. It was as though the world around him was holding its breath, waiting for something. He clenched the steering wheel, his knuckles white. Get a grip. Just a breakdown, that's all. He didn't believe his own words. Not anymore. Reluctantly, he pushed the door open. The moment he stepped outside, the cold hit him like a slap in the face. It was unnatural, too cold for the time of year. The air itself seemed to hum with an oppressive weight, pressing down on his chest. His boots crunched against the gravel as he made his way around to the front of the truck. The sound seemed too loud, too jarring in the otherwise dead silence. As he opened the hood to check the engine, the darkness pressed in closer. His breath came in shallow, visible puffs, the temperature dropping by the second. His hands fumbled in the dim light, but no matter what he did, the engine refused to start. He could feel the weight of the fog creeping around him, like it was watching, waiting. Then came the movement. It was subtle at first, a shift in the shadows along the tree line, just out of the corner of his eye. He turned, squinting into the fog, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. The trees swayed, but not with the wind. There was something else, something moving between them, something larger. The branches creaked as though being disturbed by something unseen, something massive. He backed away from the truck, his heart pounding harder now, every instinct in his body screaming that he was not alone. The shadows in the woods were shifting again, closer this time. He could hear them now, the faint crunch of leaves, the snap of twigs, and then footsteps, slow, deliberate, growing nearer. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The footsteps stopped. The silence was even worse. From somewhere deep within the fog, he thought he saw movement. Something tall, something dark, weaving through the trees with an unnatural grace. It was watching him. He knew it. He could feel its gaze, heavy and cold, piercing through the fog. Suddenly, a rustling sound came from behind him, too close. He spun around, only to find nothing there. The fog swirled lazily, undisturbed, mocking him with its silence. A chill ran down his spine, and his pulse quickened as he made a decision. Get back in the truck, lock the doors, and wait until morning. The dark had a way of making things worse. He could fix this, could figure it out when the sun came up. But as he turned to head back, the world seemed to shift. The fog grew denser, and with it came the sound, low and guttural, like something scraping beneath the truck. He stopped in his tracks, listening. The noise grew louder, more frantic, as if something was clawing its way from the undercarriage. Panic surged through him. He bolted for the cab, throwing the door open and slamming it shut behind him. His breath came in ragged gasps as he sat there, staring out into the fog. The scratching continued, relentless, like nails raking across metal, clawing to get in. Then, the temperature dropped sharply inside the cab. His breath fogged the windows, thick and heavy, but there was something else. He leaned forward, eyes wide, heart pounding as the fog on the inside of the glass began to move. Slowly, impossibly, handprints appeared, small at first, but then more, dozens of them, all pressing against the glass from the outside. A single handprint, small and delicate like that of a child, slid down the driver's side window, leaving a smudged trail behind it. Then another, and another. They weren't alone. He wasn't alone. The cab of the truck was suffocating now, the air thick with dread. The handprints multiplied, pressing harder against the glass, smudging into grotesque streaks as if desperate to claw their way inside. Each one formed in agonizing slow motion, growing larger and more erratic, as though more hands, more beings, were gathering outside, unseen in the choking fog. The driver sat paralyzed, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. His mind raced, trying to rationalize the impossible. "This can't be happening," he whispered, his voice trembling, barely audible over the now deafening silence outside. His fingers twitched toward the ignition, though deep down he knew the truck was dead. Then the stench hit him. It was foul, rancid, like decaying meat left to rot in the heat for days. He gagged, covering his mouth as the smell invaded the cab, thick and oily, coating his throat. His eyes watered from the acrid stench, and a cold sweat broke out along his brow. Suddenly, the radio flickered to life again. No static this time, but a low, guttural sound, like a chorus of inhuman voices muttering in unison. The words were unintelligible, yet laced with a dark, malevolent energy. It felt like they were speaking directly to him, pulling at something deep in his mind. He reached for the dial, trying to turn it off, but the knob wouldn't budge. His fingers trembled, slipping uselessly against the plastic as the voices grew louder, their words starting to take shape, the language old and wrong, ancient, something primal that shouldn't be heard by human ears. Then it said his name again, not in a distorted, broken tone, but clear, direct. The voice was low and wet, like something buried deep beneath the earth, and it echoed inside the truck as though it was speaking from the very fog itself. The scratching under the truck intensified, furious now, as if something trapped beneath the vehicle was trying to claw its way out. The metal frame groaned under the pressure, the entire truck shaking slightly as the entity beneath scraped and banged with growing urgency. The windows fogged over again, but this time the condensation came from inside the cab. His own breath mingled with something else, something cold, as if the air itself had turned to ice. He shuddered, his hands shaking uncontrollably as he rubbed his arms in a vain attempt to ward off the unnatural chill creeping through the cab. And then, without warning, the fog on the inside of the windshield cleared for just a moment, just long enough for him to see the reflection. A face, not his own, stared back at him from the glass. It was gaunt, pale, with hollow eyes that seemed to go on forever, black as the void. Its mouth was wide open, lips stretched too far, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too long. It was smiling, though the smile held no warmth, only hunger. The driver's breath caught in his throat as the face shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly, like it was waiting for him to acknowledge it. The eyes never blinked, never moved from his own. It was as if it was studying him, as though it knew every dark corner of his mind and was savoring the moment before it would strike. He jerked away, his heart pounding in his ears, the reflection gone the moment he looked back. But the cold remained, settling into his bones, along with the sound, the scratching that was no longer beneath the truck. It was inside the cab. The back of the truck groaned, as though the weight of something massive was shifting. He dared not turn around, but the sensation of movement, of something breathing just behind him, was overwhelming. Every hair on his body stood on end, a primal instinct warning him that whatever had been scratching at the truck, whatever had left those handprints on the glass, was now with him. The radio clicked off with a soft pop, plunging the truck into a heavy, oppressive silence. He could hear his own breath, ragged and uneven, but beneath that, something else, breathing, slow and deliberate, as though it were mimicking his own. The presence behind him grew thicker, denser, pressing against his back like a wall of icy fog, close enough that he could feel the cold radiating off it, almost touching him. And then tap, tap, tap. The sound came from right beside his ear, a light but deliberate tapping, like fingernails on glass. His skin prickled, the blood draining from his face as he slowly, so slowly, turned his head. There, on the passenger window, a small handprint appeared, pale and skeletal, the fingers splayed wide, pressing gently against the glass from the inside. It slid downward with agonizing slowness, leaving a faint, greasy smear in its wake. His heart hammered in his chest. He was no longer alone in the truck. Something had come in, something that shouldn't be here, and it was waiting. He tried to move, to scream, but his body refused to obey. The cold had seeped into his muscles, locking him in place, paralyzed by the presence surrounding him. The fog outside swirled like a living thing, and through it, more shapes began to emerge. Dozens of them, figures with hollow eyes and open mouths, their faces twisted in eternal anguish. They were all watching him, waiting. And then, without warning, the truck's lights flickered back on, illuminating the road ahead. But the fog didn't retreat. It hung thick and heavy, obscuring everything except for one thing. Far ahead, in the distance, something moved, a shadowy figure, tall and distorted, shifting in the mist like smoke. It didn't approach, but its presence was overwhelming. The air felt heavy, almost too thick to breathe. The driver's heart sank. Whatever it was coming for him. The truck hurtled down the endless, fog-choked road, the headlights barely cutting through the thick gloom. The oppressive weight of the unseen presence still clung to the cab, as though it had sunk its claws deep into the fabric of reality itself, dragging everything deeper into its nightmarish grasp. The driver's hands were slick with sweat, his body shaking uncontrollably as the truck swerved through the darkness. The voices hadn't stopped. They were inside him now, crawling through his mind, whispering terrible things in that ancient, forgotten language. He couldn't understand the words, but he could feel their intent. The weight of them pressed against his thoughts, demanding, insistent. The truck's engine groaned under the strain, the headlights flickering with every bump in the road, casting long shadows that twisted and writhed in the fog. His heart pounded in his chest, each beat a countdown to some inevitable horror, some final revelation that he wasn't sure he could survive. As he tore around another curve, something flickered in the darkness ahead, a glint of metal. He barely had time to react, slamming the brakes and swerving to avoid it. The truck skidded, tires screeching, and came to a grinding halt on the narrow shoulder of the road. Breathless, the driver blinked hard, trying to focus through the panic. His headlights illuminated what had nearly ended his escape, a twisted wreckage of metal and shattered glass. It was a truck, just like his, long abandoned and rusted with age, its trailer crushed against the jagged cliffs that lined the road. He stared at it, confusion mingling with the dread that coiled tighter around him. The wreck looked ancient, as though it had been sitting there for decades, yet something about it felt eerily familiar. Stepping out of the truck, he moved closer, drawn to the wreck as if something beyond his control was pulling him toward it. The fog swirled thickly around his legs as he approached the mangled vehicle, the air heavy with the smell of rust and decay. And then, as the fog parted, he saw them. Scattered across the wreckage were the remains of other vehicles, trucks, cars, motorcycles, each one twisted and broken, their rusted skeletons a grim reminder of the road's countless victims. Some were half buried in the earth, as if they'd been here for years, their drivers long forgotten. But it wasn't the vehicles that sent ice through his veins. It was the bodies. Skeletal remains lay slumped in the driver's seats, some twisted in unnatural positions, their hands frozen in eternal death grips on their steering wheels. Others had spilled out onto the road, their bones bleached white by time, their faces locked in expressions of terror. Empty eye sockets stared up at him, their jaws open wide as if they had died screaming. His stomach lurched, bile rising in his throat. The bodies weren't just here, they had been trapped here, their final moments etched into their bones, reliving the nightmare over and over. The driver staggered backward, his mind reeling. The apparitions he had been seeing in the fog, they weren't just ghosts. They were the souls of these lost drivers, forever cursed to wander this road, their bodies long dead but their spirits still shackled to this hellish place. He took another step back, his foot catching on something buried in the dirt. He looked down and saw the remnants of a torn jacket, half buried under debris. His heart skipped a beat as he bent down to examine it, his fingers brushing over the faded logo on the back. It was the same logo that adorned his own truck, the emblem of his company. Cold realization washed over him like a bucket of ice water. This wreck wasn't just a random truck. It had belonged to someone who worked for the same company, someone who had taken this cursed route before him. As he stood there, the voice in his head grew louder, more insistent, filling him with a dark truth he hadn't wanted to confront. The legends were real. The path of death wasn't just a road. It was a trap, a place that fed on the souls of those who dared to drive it. The fog, the shadows, the figures, they weren't accidents or hallucinations. They were the lost souls of the road's victims, forever bound to its twisted reality. And now, it wanted him. Panic surged through him. He had to get out, now. He turned and ran back to his truck, every step feeling like a lead weight as the fog thickened around him. The wrecks seemed to close in from all sides, as if the road itself was pulling him deeper into its web. His breath came in ragged gasps, the sound of his footsteps muffled by the oppressive mist. As he reached the cab, he yanked the door open and threw himself inside, slamming it shut behind him. His hands shook as he fumbled with the ignition, the engine coughing weakly before sputtering to life once more. He floored the gas, the truck lurching forward as the wreckage faded into the fog behind him. But no matter how fast he drove, the whispers didn't stop. The voices in his head grew louder, more desperate, and the fog seemed to stretch on forever, as if the road itself had no end. And then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it. The shadow, the same grotesque, shifting figure from before. Only this time, it was no longer content to linger in the distance. It was chasing him. The air grew heavy, suffocating, as the thing closed in. The fog writhed around it, bending reality itself. Its shape was impossible to define. One moment it was humanoid, the next, a mass of writhing darkness, limbs twisting and contorting in unnatural ways. Faces formed in its shifting body, mouths opening wide in silent screams, before dissolving back into the void. The driver's heart raced as he pushed the truck harder, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. But the thing was gaining on him, its twisted form stretching, growing, its many mouths whispering in that terrible ancient language. It was no longer just watching. It was coming for him. The road ahead stretched endlessly, the fog swirling with a life of its own, wrapping tighter around the truck like the coils of a serpent. The air inside the cab felt thick, heavy, as though something was pressing down on him, suffocating him in the claustrophobic space. But the worst was the thing behind him, the grotesque, shifting mass of darkness that seemed to pulse with every breath he took. It was gaining, and no matter how fast he pushed the truck, it was always there, closing in. The whispers in his mind became a deafening roar, the ancient language pouring into his thoughts like venom, twisting his reality. His vision blurred as the truck lurched forward, the road beneath him warping, shifting, as though it was no longer bound by the laws of the physical world. His hands gripped the wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white, sweat pouring down his face as he tried to keep control. But the road no longer cared about his control. The creature behind him grew larger, its form expanding, distorting, as if it was feeding off the fear that clung to him like a second skin. Its shifting body took on new shapes, limbs twisting and bending at impossible angles, its many faces, grotesque, contorted with agony, emerging and dissolving in the dark mass. Eyes blinked open, wide and hollow, staring through him, as if seeing straight into his soul. And the voices, those terrible voices, grew louder. They spoke to him, not in the language of men, but in that ancient, primal tongue. He didn't understand the words, but the meaning was clear. It was claiming him. This road has taken many. You are nothing but the next. Suddenly, the truck's headlights flickered, casting erratic shadows on the road ahead. The beams swung wildly as the truck veered left and right, the road no longer obeying the simple rules of geometry. It twisted and undulated like a snake writhing in its death throes, pulling him deeper into a world that no longer felt like his own. And then the engine sputtered. No, no, no. He slammed his fist against the steering wheel, the truck groaning as the gears ground to a halt. He stomped on the gas pedal, but the engine whined, powerless, as if the truck itself had given up. Behind him, the shadow was nearly upon him now, its form towering above the truck, tendrils of black fog reaching out like hands, fingers long and clawed, stretching toward the cab. The faces in the darkness writhed and twisted, mouths open wide in silent screams, and in the center of it all, one larger face emerged, the same terrible visage he had seen reflected in the window before. Its eyes locked onto his, empty and soulless, but filled with hunger. The whispers in his mind shifted. They weren't unintelligible anymore. They were words, clear and precise, spoken in a voice that was deep and resonant, ancient and cruel. "You are mine." Panic surged through him, but something deeper, some primal instinct buried beneath the layers of fear, forced him to act. He couldn't outrun it. He couldn't hide. The road was alive, bending reality itself to trap him. And this thing, this darkness, wasn't just a creature. It was the very heart of this cursed place. It had been waiting for him all along. There was only one choice left. He had to confront it. Heart racing, he threw open the truck's door, stumbling out into the thick fog. The cold hit him like a wall, chilling him to the bone, but he didn't stop. He turned, facing the thing directly for the first time, his entire body trembling as the shadow loomed before him, its shifting mass towering above him, pulsating with dark energy. The air around him vibrated with the weight of the entity's presence, the fog swirling in tighter, as if it were closing a fist around him. Its many mouths whispered in unison now, the guttural sound filling the night, making his head throb. It was feeding off his fear, growing stronger, more defined. The driver took a shaky step forward. His breath came in short, ragged bursts, but he forced himself to keep moving. He couldn't let it win. Not like this. He stumbled closer, his feet dragging through the gravel, eyes locked on the towering figure of darkness. The whispers in his head began to change, shifting from the alien language to something more familiar, something he understood. "Give yourself to the road. You will never leave. You are already dead." The words twisted around his thoughts like vines, trying to root him in place, but he fought against them. "No," he whispered through gritted teeth, his voice trembling. "You won't take me." The shadow pulsed, growing darker, angrier, as though the refusal had somehow insulted it. The fog thickened, the weight of it pressing down on him until he could barely breathe. But then, through the crushing weight of the fog, a realization began to form, a dark, horrifying truth. The road didn't just want him dead. It needed something more. It wanted a sacrifice. The driver's eyes widened as the pieces clicked into place. The apparitions, the wreckage, the lost souls. It had never been about taking him directly. The road required an offering, something to satisfy its endless hunger, and if he didn't give it what it wanted, it would claim him, just like it had claimed the others. His truck. His only connection to the world beyond this cursed road. He looked back at the vehicle, still idling weakly, its lights flickering in the fog. It was the one thing he had left, the one symbol of his life, his identity as a driver, as a man who had lived on the road for years. But now, he realized, it wasn't his life that mattered. The truck was the key. He turned back toward the shadow, his voice steadying as he forced the words out. "You want a sacrifice? Take the truck. Take it and leave me." The shadow froze, its many faces shifting, its mouths stilling in unison as if considering the offer. The air around him grew colder, sharper, and then, slowly, the darkness began to retreat, the tendrils of fog unwinding from the truck. The entity lingered for a moment longer, its hollow eyes staring through him, and then it accepted. The ground beneath the truck began to crack, the asphalt splintering as the vehicle sank into the earth, swallowed by the road itself. The headlights blinked once, twice, and then disappeared into the darkness, leaving nothing behind but silence and cold fog. The driver stood alone, the weight of the road lifting, the oppressive presence fading. The voices fell silent, leaving only the soft whisper of the wind. The road stretched out before him once more, empty, endless, but no longer watching him. He had given it what it wanted. For now, the truck was gone, swallowed by the cursed road, taken as an offering to whatever dark force had claimed this place. The driver stood there, trembling in the bitter cold, staring at the cracked asphalt where his rig had been only moments before. His breath came in shallow bursts, the night air biting against his skin, but the oppressive weight had finally lifted. The shadow, the grotesque mass of darkness, had retreated, though he could still feel its presence lingering at the edges of his mind, waiting. For the first time in what felt like hours, the road ahead was silent. No whispers, no tapping, no shifting figures in the fog. Just a dead, suffocating quiet that pressed in on all sides. He looked around, disoriented, unsure of what to do next. His truck, his one lifeline, was gone, but he was still here. The road stretched on before him, winding endlessly into the dark unknown, its path hidden beneath the thick, unyielding mist. The realization struck him hard. The road wasn't done with him. The sacrifice had been accepted, but now it demanded something more. His survival wasn't guaranteed. He had to get out. He had to escape. Without the truck, he had no choice but to move on foot. His legs felt heavy, weak, as though they barely belonged to him anymore, but he forced them to move, each step a battle against the cold that seeped into his bones. The fog seemed to shift and swirl around him, but the road remained visible, a thin, twisted path winding through the darkness. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but there was no turning back. Not now. His only hope was to move forward. The fog thickened as he walked, closing in around him like a shroud, and the road became even narrower, more treacherous, the jagged cliffs on either side looming like open mouths ready to devour him if he took a wrong step. But he kept moving, driven by something deeper than fear. He had to make it to the end. As he walked, the voices returned, not as whispers, but as faint echoes, as though they were coming from somewhere far behind him, carried on the wind. He didn't turn to look. He knew what was there, the lost souls, the broken wreckage of those who had come before him, the twisted remains of the drivers who had vanished into the fog. He had seen their fate. He wasn't going to share it. The road bent sharply, and as he rounded the corner, something changed. The fog began to thin, just slightly, revealing the faintest outline of trees beyond the road. His heart skipped a beat. Was this it? Was he finally reaching the end? But the relief was short-lived. From somewhere deep in the mist, he heard it again, That sound. The shadow. It was back, and it was hunting him. The driver's breath caught in his throat as the fog darkened behind him, the shadowy figure beginning to take shape once more, its grotesque form shifting and pulsing in the mist. The many faces emerged again, mouths open wide, their hollow eyes fixed on him, hunger etched into every inch of their twisted forms. It hadn't accepted the truck. It had only been appeased for a moment. Now, it wanted more. His pulse quickened as the dark presence moved closer, the air around him growing colder, thicker, as though reality itself was bending under the weight of the shadow's approach. The road seemed to stretch out before him, impossibly long, winding deeper into the fog. He could hear the entity's whispers growing louder, its voice slithering into his mind once more, urging him to give in. But he couldn't. Not now. Not when he was so close. He broke into a run, his boots pounding against the cracked asphalt, the sound of his footsteps barely audible over the growing roar in his head. The road twisted and curved beneath him, the fog shifting like a living thing, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The shadow was right behind him, moving faster, growing larger, its many faces twisted in grotesque, silent screams. The air crackled with energy, the oppressive weight of the entity pressing down on him, threatening to pull him back into the darkness. He ran harder, lungs burning, muscles screaming in protest. His vision blurred as the fog closed in, but there, just ahead, he saw it, a faint glimmer of light, barely visible through the thick mist. It was small, distant, but unmistakable. The end of the road. With renewed strength, he pushed himself harder, each step a desperate fight against the pull of the darkness behind him. The light grew closer, brighter, a beacon in the endless night. He could hear the shadow's breath now, feel its icy presence reaching out for him, but he didn't stop. The boundary between the haunted road and reality blurred, the fog twisting in strange, unnatural patterns, the ground beneath him cracking and shifting as if the road itself was trying to trap him. His thoughts tangled, his mind a blur of fear and exhaustion, but he kept his eyes on the light. Closer, just a little closer. The shadow lunged, its many tendrils reaching out to pull him back, its voice a cacophony of whispers and screams in his ears. The air grew so cold he could barely breathe, and for a moment he thought he wouldn't make it. He could feel the darkness pulling at him, dragging him back into the void. But then he reached the light. His body crossed the threshold, and as he stumbled forward, the fog suddenly lifted, the oppressive weight vanishing in an instant. He collapsed to the ground, gasping for breath, his heart pounding in his chest. The cold receded, replaced by a strange warmth that felt almost foreign after the suffocating chill of the road. When he looked up, the road behind him was gone. The fog, the shadow, the voices, it had all vanished, swallowed by the night. He was standing at the edge of a highway, the faint glow of streetlights in the distance. The real world. He had made it. But as he stood there, his legs shaking, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching. The shadow, the road, it wasn't gone. Not really. It was just waiting. And though he had escaped, the thought lingered in the back of his mind. The path of death doesn't let go that easily. For a moment, all was still. The real world had returned, solid, familiar, a stark contrast to the twisted nightmare of the cursed road. The driver stood at the edge of the highway, his chest heaving with each ragged breath, the warmth of reality seeping back into his bones. His mind was still spinning, still processing the impossibility of what had happened. But he was here. He was free, or so he thought. The relief was fleeting. In the pit of his stomach, a nagging feeling stirred, something that whispered he wasn't truly safe. He glanced back over his shoulder, half expecting to see the fog rolling in again, creeping back toward him with its many shadows and whispers. But the road behind him was empty. just pavement stretching into the distance, lined with gnarled trees. Still, the feeling lingered, that terrible sense of being watched. He turned back toward the faint glow of distant streetlights and began to walk, his legs weak and unsteady. Every step felt heavier than the last, as if the road itself was pulling at him, trying to drag him back. But it was over, wasn't it? He had made the sacrifice, escaped the cursed road. He should be free. Yet something wasn't right. The air around him had grown unnaturally still, the sound of his footsteps echoing unervingly in the quiet night. The wind had died, and even the trees that lined the road seemed frozen, their branches unnaturally still in the dark. He walked faster, pushing forward toward the safety of the lights in the distance, but the feeling of dread gnawed at him with every step. Then, from behind him, a sound, a low, rumbling growl. He froze. His heart skipped a beat, the blood in his veins turning to ice. Slowly he turned, his eyes scanning the empty highway behind him. But it wasn't empty anymore. The fog was back. It rolled in slowly at first, a thin layer crawling along the ground, twisting and swirling like smoke, and through it something moved, something dark and massive, its shape shifting and contorting in the mist. The shadow, the thing from the road, was back. It had found him. The road had not let him go after all. His body tensed, every muscle screaming at him to run, but his legs wouldn't move. He was frozen, paralyzed by the sheer weight of the entity's presence. The fog swirled thicker now, rising like a living thing, and the shadow grew larger, taking shape in the mist. It was no longer distant. It was here, and it was coming for him. The faces appeared again, twisting and writhing in the darkness. Those hollow eyes, those wide, gaping mouths, frozen in silent screams of terror. The thing's many limbs stretched out toward him, tendrils of black fog reaching for his body, hungry, insatiable. And then the voices started again. That terrible, guttural whisper, crawling into his thoughts, filling his mind with its dark intent. You thought you could escape. The driver's heart raced, panic surging through him as the shadow surged forward, its shape distorting, its many mouths opening wider, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. The road itself seemed to bend beneath its weight, the fog twisting in unnatural patterns as the entity closed the distance. This was it. There was no truck to sacrifice this time, no offering to give, just him. And the road had decided it wanted him, but he wouldn't let it take him, not without a fight. The driver broke into a run, sprinting toward the distant lights, his lungs burning as the cold night air filled his chest. The shadow behind him roared, the sound like 1,000 voices crying out in unison, a twisted symphony of despair. He could feel it closing in, the cold tendrils of the fog brushing against his skin, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The lights ahead flickered, wavering as if they too were part of the road's twisted reality, but he kept running. His legs burned with every step, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he pushed harder, faster, as the entity behind him grew larger, its dark form looming over him like a tidal wave of shadow. The voices in his mind grew louder, screaming now, demanding that he stop, that he surrender to the road. But he wouldn't. He had come too far. He wouldn't let it take him. The lights were closer now, just a few more steps. He could feel the warmth of them, the pull of reality just beyond the edge of the road. He reached out, his hand outstretched toward the light, desperate for its warmth, its safety. But the shadow was faster. With a final, deafening roar, the entity lunged, its tendrils of darkness wrapping around his legs, pulling him backward. The driver screamed, his body jerking as he fought against the pull, his fingers clawing at the asphalt, trying to drag himself forward. The light was so close, just a few feet away, but the road refused to let him go. The fog swirled around him, the voices in his head laughing, mocking his struggle. The shadow tightened its grip, pulling him closer to the void, closer to the darkness that waited just beyond the edge of reality. But then, in a final, desperate burst of strength, the driver kicked. His boot slammed into the ground, breaking the shadow's hold for just a moment, a split second of freedom. He surged forward, throwing himself toward the light with everything he had left. And then, he was through. The warmth hit him like a wave, the light washing over him, and suddenly, the shadow was gone. The fog, the road, the voices, all of it vanished, leaving only the stillness of the night and the faint hum of the streetlights above him. The driver collapsed to the ground, his body trembling, his breath coming in ragged, uneven gasps. He was on the other side. He had made it. The path of death had released him. He lay there for a long time, the cool asphalt beneath him grounding him to reality. The distant sound of cars passing by reached his ears, and the smell of the earth, the trees, and the night air filled his senses. It was over. But as he stood, legs shaky beneath him, a final, chilling thought crossed his mind. The road always finds a way. He walked into the light, away from the cursed road, but he knew the truth. He had escaped, but not for long. The path of death had claimed many, and one day it would call for him again, and next time he wouldn't be so lucky.